Hello, everybody. Today we are welcoming Davide Gnoato to hold a presentation. Davide studied German, English, and Roman studies and Slavic studies in Trento and Vienna. His main focus is the poetics of exile and literary modernism. For his current PhD project, for which he's heavily funded, first got the EFK fellowship, and now you have a new fellowship?
Yeah, well, it's not a fellowship, it's a stipend, ÖAD stipend, Maria Blau.
Yeah, ÖAD. It's a fancy Austrian stipend. And for this PhD project, Davide looks into the history of one of the most iconic publishing houses of post-war Italy, Adelphi. Adelphi, after the editors split from Einaudi, became really a hotbed of world literature. Not only did it promote Austrian letters, namely Schnitzler, Kraus, and Canetti, but it established the prominence of authors such as Sándor Márai and Johannes Urzidil in Italy. In a way, Adelphi was crucial in establishing the mythical space of Mitteleuropa, about which we will be hearing more later. Alongside his academic work, Davide is a prolific book reviewer for the Austrian magazine Medienimpulse, and also, I should point out, a radio producer. As an aficionado of East Asian pop myself, I should recommend you the radio show that he did on Japanese pop music, in fact, city pop, which is a sophisticated form of elevator music from the 1980s. And he did it with Radio Orange last year.
Still doing.
Still doing it. Mm-hmm. So it's a series now.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Okay, we should all hear it. But today, Davide will not be speaking about city pop, but on Mitteleuropa, obviously from an Adelphi angle. Yeah, we're looking forward to hear your insights.
Thank you. So I will let also circulate some copies of Adelphi books, also to have the haptic experience, so to say. I can divide them into branches, where we will come also to the books a little bit later. This paper is about how a concept travels, how it leaves one cultural context, crosses a border, and arrives somewhere actually else, almost entirely changed. Now, yes. And yet, curiously, even though completely changed, more alive than before. The concept is the so-called Mitteleuropa. I always should mark this under, en guillemets, how we say in French. And this is a term, Mitteleuropa, that in the German-speaking world carries a specific and also troubling political history, but was gradually reinvested among all in post-war Italy with an entirely different set of meanings: cultural, literary, atmospheric, and ultimately imaginary. I'm very glad that I can speak about this here today in Bratislava, which is one of the, let's call them, capitals of this imaginary and maybe not that imaginary Mitteleuropa. The Italian case is an unusually instructive one for anyone interested in the broader questions of mediation, imaginary geography, and cultural bias in the literary reception. And most studies of Mitteleuropa focus on its Eastern Central European protagonists, on what Milan Kundera, Danilo Kish, or Claudia Magrisa thought it meant. The Italian perspective inverts this here. Mitteleuropa is not a concept debated from within, but one received from without, filtered through the specific cultural needs and individual sensibilities of a country with its own complex relationship to the historical realities the term invoked. Italy was not a Central European country except for one single city that became part of the Italian state after World War I, and thus followed the precarious national destiny of cities like Uzhhorod, Lviv, Rijeka, Lublin, etc. This city was Trieste. Starting from this corner of Central Europe, of Central European cultural landscape, now turned Italian for the sake of new nationalism, we can trace from the 1960s onwards one of the most sustained and distinctive receptions of Central European literature anywhere in the world through a scholar and industrial conjunct effort. At the center of my investigation is the Milanese publishing house Adelphi Edizioni. You see the books circulating. Founded in 1962, and to my knowledge, one of the major publishers in Europe, at least, to maintain Middle European literature as an explicit standing alone catalog category, distinct from both German literature and Slavic literatures. That taxonomic act is not merely administrative. It is an intervention in the cultural map of Europe. The 150 titles in that catalog constitute a canon whose examination by author, language, chronology, and series allows us to read the construction of an imaginary geography as a publishing practice. My argument is threefold. One, that the Italian conceptualization of Mitteleuropa was a genuine re-semantization, not translation, but rather construction. That this was achieved, number two, primarily through publishing mediation, above all through the philosophy of the so-called singular book, developed by Roberto Bobby Baslen, a name which we will encounter later during the paper, and he came from Trieste. And that his mediation was not neutral, carrying a structural bias towards German language authors over Slavic and Hungarian ones that shaped the Italian imaginary of Eastern Central Europe in ways which are still visible today. This third point I raise with particular care before this audience here in Bratislava. Overcoming this bias should be nothing new for you. And therefore, since the rediscovery of Eastern Central European culture and literature in Italy passed forcefully through the German studies and Italo-German speakers, this bias should not be a surprise. But this narrow perspective still allowed, as we will see, a widening of literary canon reception that eventually would benefit the perceived littérature mineure and their struggle for recognition, in fact, as major ones. This paper proceeds through the Habsburg myth and its critical reception, two key theoretical concepts, the concept of Stimmung and the concept of the posthumous man, posthumous person, actually, the biography and philosophy of Roberto Baslen, Adelphi's paratextual strategies, a detailed analysis of the catalog, the mechanisms of a re-semantization, and a conclusion on what this case teaches us about how imaginary geographies are built and how they might be revised. Mitteleuropa achieved its widest circulation through Friedrich von Naumann's book of the same name, published in Berlin, 1915, which cast Central Europe as a program of German imperial expansion. When an Italian translation appeared in 1918, still during the war, the term entered Italian with a double face already inscribed upon it. The Italian Encyclopedia of 1929 recorded as duality, Europa Centrale for purely geographical purposes, and the untranslated Mitteleuropa reserved for German imperial ambition. From the 1980s onwards, scholars increasingly preferred the term East Central Europe. The scholar John Neubauer, drawing on Jene Süd's work, argued for reconceptualizing the region internally, away from divisive nationalisms. Neubauer himself pointedly retitled Naumann's concept Mitteleuropa, a deutscher Traum, a German dream. Authors we now associate with geography, with this kind of geography, Danilo Kish, Milan Kundera, Czesław Miłosz, Georgi Sheveskin, etc., did not obviously in their original languages call themselves Mitteleuropa, even though I must say here a famous book by Danilo Kish, Variations of Middle European Themes, uses exactly this terminology, Variacje na srednjoeuropejskie temy. So actually central and or middle and Middle Europe and not Central Europe. The German and Italian translations imposed the label in the end, Middle European. In Italian, Mitteleuropeo remains a remarkably stable adjective, appearing consistently within a semantic field that is literary rather than political. From descriptions of Trieste's original Italo-Svevo as esponente della cultura mitteleuropea to a Germanist's characterization of the founder of modern Italian German studies, Ladislaa Mittnera. Mittnera could be the personification of the Italian comprehension of the term Mitteleuropa. Himself an Italo-Hungarian Croat from Rijeka, speaking Fiumano at home, a Venetian dialect, and later in life teaching German-speaking literature in Venice. In few words, a disappeared cosmos of plurality, both foreign and autochthonous. In the Italian pronunciation, German Mitteleuropa, becoming Italian Mitteleuropa, is a folk etymological naturalization, a sign that the term had genuinely ceased to be foreign. It arrived not as a political instrument, but as an aesthetic category in trying to integrate what, after World War II and the Holocaust, was perceived as the lost side of the West, and through the agency of specific people. Chief among them, this man from Trieste, Roberto Bobby Baslen, who never published a word under his own name. To understand why Italy proved such a fertile ground for a culturally re-cementized Mitteleuropa, we must trace the concept's own metamorphosis in the German-speaking world, particularly in Austria. After Naumann's version had been discredited by the outcome of the First World War, Austrian cultural figures were compelled to find alternative framings. In 1916, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, still during the war, offered one such response in his essay, Austria as Reflected in His Poetry. A vision that later took increasingly concrete form at the Salzburg Festspiele Festival. And Austria defined not by German linguistic hegemony, but by the folk diversity of its peoples, united by a common civilizational tradition rather than an imperial program. This vision was not without its own mystifications anyway. The naive notion of a multi-ethnic Austria unified by culture sought to counter both German imperialism and the Metternician Pax through a less dangerous mythology, which is very evident in libretti like the Rosenkavalier, the Knight of the Rose, or Arabella, which both premiered in Dresden. But this was a mythology nonetheless, one with real political consequences, most notably the implicit denial of the principle of national self-determination in the name of a conservatism that concealed a void behind its own myths. Like Janos, this new Central Europe had two faces. One looked forward towards overcoming the identity crisis of the First Austrian Republic, and the other one looked back to a past that appeared all the more glorious the further it receded from view. Nowadays, we have another bigger country in the world which is going more or less through the same cultural proceeding, and we see the consequences anyway. So this double-faced structure is precisely what the Trieste-based Germanist Claudia Magrisa identified and named in 1963 when he published his dissertation named the Habsburg myth in the modern Austrian literature. with Einaudi in Turin. Magris described a mythical complex that had structured Austrian literary consciousness since the late 19th century. A nostalgic, elegiac image of the Habsburg world as a space of orderly coexistence, of melancholic beauty, of a civilization in gentle decline. As Renate Lunzer has observed, this vision operated primarily on the connotative rather than the notative level, conveyed through what Magris himself described as nuances of certain adjectives and turns of phrase, rather than through explicit historical and political argument. But here we must pause and introduce a critical correction that is essential for any honest reckoning with this material, and that I think deserves particular weight before this audience here in Bratislava. The Kish correction, Danilo Kish's correction, we might call it, in his Central European Variations, which I already mentioned, of 1986, Danilo Kish formulated the problem with characteristic precision. I quote in English, I sourced it in German, translated in English, whether we adopt the centripetal or centrifugal theory, whether Vienna was the center of all cultural life, or whether Central European culture existed precisely against Vienna as a negative reaction, both theories have become historically irrelevant. The new geopolitical division of Europe has cut Vienna off from its former allies, and Budapest, Prague, Warsaw, Bucharest are now closer to Moscow than to Vienna. Whether Central European culture exists because of Vienna or against Vienna, both positions had become historically moot after 1945. This is not merely a geopolitical observation, it is a warning against a certain aestheticizing idealization. The cultural historian Victor Suchy noted at the 1973 Gorizia Conference on Mitteleuropa that this could lead one into a hall of mirrors, an imaginary choir of spirits with Romance, Slavic, Magyar, and Germanic voices that evoked a dialectic of consonance and dissonance, but one so thoroughly mythologized as to obscure the actual power asymmetries of rulers and ruled in the multi-ethnic state. Kish's warning is not a reason anyway to abandon the concept, and it himself did not. But is a reason to hold it with critical self-awareness. The dominant voices through which Mitteleuropa was reconstructed and transmitted were overwhelmingly German-speaking. That asymmetry, I argue, is not incidental but structural, inscribed into the very mechanism of mediation, and beginning with the personal biography of Roberto Basler. The impact of Magris' book was felt first in Austria, at a critical juncture in the reconstruction of national identity following the withdrawal of the occupying powers in 1855. Lunzer notes that this Austrian Renaissance, as she calls it, raised urgent questions of cultural belonging, and Magris' work, despite its critical stance, fostered a growing sense of Central European responsibility among Austrian intellectuals. But the paradox is constitutive. In questioning the myth, there was always a risk of reinforcing it. As Radoslav Konstantinovich noted, Magris, the young progressive scholar who had approached the Habsburg myth with irony, found himself, in time, partially seduced by the fascination he had set out to analyze. It is a paradox that runs through the entire Italian reception of the concept. Before turning to Italy's reception, I want to dwell on a concept central to understanding how Mitteleuropa functioned as a cultural rather than political category. Stimmung, mood, atmosphere, the affective tonality of a literary world. Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht has argued that atmosphere in literature functions as a mechanism for transmitting what cannot be directly said. In other words, it touches the reader from the inside. The translator Ursula Gräfe described literary translation as a Übersetzen, crossing to another shore in German, attaining less to syntax than to the camp of Stimmung, Stimmungsfeld, the field of mood, so to say, that the author generates. This is precisely the effect that Central European literature achieved in Italy. Not the exoticization of an alien world, but the creation of a recognizable, yet irreducibly strange, in the sense of stranger, atmosphere. Friedrich Thorberg, in his memoir, Tante Jolisch, Beyond Jolisch, one of the foundational texts of post-war Habsburg nostalgia, evoked this atmosphere in a passage that shows the mechanism at work and, read critically, its limitations. I quote in English, Prague and Budapest still stood in the liveliest exchange with Vienna, intellectually, artistically, atmospherically, in the time between the two wars. The Bohemian spas and the Dalmatian seaside resorts, the Hungarian summer retreats and the Slovak winter sports resorts still belonged to the familiar landscape of the Austrians. The Prague Daily, the Pest-Lioid, the Czernowitz morning paper still lay in the Viennese coffee houses as a matter of course. Notice that what this passage does. It paints a landscape of simultaneity and ease. Slovak winter resorts, Dalmatian baths, Viennese actors in Moravian theaters, in which everything coexists without conflict, without hierarchy, without friction. Now, apart from the fact that this case of simultaneity was very well described by Benedict Anderson in his book about imaginary communities as a proof that the genre of the novel was intrinsically an instrument of nationalism and of imaginary geography, we must also point something else here. The Slovak winter resorts appear as a picturesque backdrop for the Austrian, but also the Czech and the Hungarian newspapers lie in the Viennese coffee house as a natural decor. The perspective is nevertheless unreflectively Viennese, what Victor Suche called the Hall of Mirrors, an image of multi-ethnic harmony that, precisely in its aesthetic seductiveness, conceals the real power symmetries of the multi-ethnic state. Atmosphere performs a politics of forgetting while appearing to celebrate a politics of plurality. Understanding how Stimmung works is essential to understanding how Mitteleuropa was transmitted. But it is also a reason to read it with both eyes open, attending simultaneously to what the atmosphere evokes and to what it occludes. Alongside Stimmung, a second concept names something essential about the literary figure at the heart of the Central European writing, what Massimo Cacciari calls the posthumous person, someone who writes, thinks, and feels from the vantage point of an already ended world. Cacciari finds its fullest embodiment in the Central European tradition, in Hofmannsthal, in Robert Walser, in Josef Roth's Wanderers, in the authors who witnessed what Karl Kraus called the joyful apocalypse of Austria-Hungary's collapse. In Cacciari's formulation, the posthumous I, actually, from the eighth of its distance, achieves not detachment, but deepest sympathy. Josef Roth calls such figures Invaliden des Lebens, invalids of life, people who carry the wreckage of a destroyed world within them, whose writing is the transmutation of that wreckage into form. This literature is recognizable by its obsessive attention to atmosphere, its preference for the fragmentary, a persistent irony that is simultaneously defense and epistemology, and an intimacy with the Unheimliche, the dead continuing to inhabit the present. This last feature connects it to what we might call a ontology of Central Europe, a mode of cultural existence in which the ghosts of a destroyed civilization remain operative as imaginative and moral reference points. The German language of writers who continued the core of this tradition, like Roth, Muse, Broch, Schnitzler, Krauss, Walser, Kafka, were the most visible inhabitants of this haunted landscape, but they were not its only inhabitants. Daniel Kish, in his conversation with Karin Rosenberg, offered what remains the most suggestive description of a shared Central European style. I quote, "The defining factor in the literature and thought of Central Europe is, quite generally speaking, precisely this, ironic lyricism. Perhaps a combination of Slavic and Hungarian lyricism with a touch of irony, that pinch of salt contributed by the Jews. Ironic lyricism, Slavic and Hungarian lyricism, with a pinch of salt, actually. For Kish, Central European literature was never Viennese literature translated outward. Boris Pahor in Slovenian, Jostasevich in Russian, Kish in Serbian, they wrote from the Slavic shore of the same ontological space, but their entry into the Italian imaginary came very later, and more obliquely for reasons rooted in the biography of the man who built this canon. And now it's finally the time that we introduce him. To understand, To understand Mitteleuropa, how Mitteleuropa became a literary category in Italy, we must understand Roberto Bobby Baslen. And to understand Baslen, we must understand Trieste. First, Trieste, not as a romantic symbol, but as a specific linguistic and existential condition. Trieste was, after 1918, was no longer a Mediterranean gateway to the Habsburg Empire, but a border city absorbed into the Italian state, losing its multicultural cosmopolitanism progressively and violently. Yet precisely this loss made it a particularly sensitive resonance body for the idea of Mitteleuropa, not a direct intermediary, as Magris himself has quoted, but a spectre, a city whose cultural life had declined sharply, but whose surviving figures carried an entire world within them. What defined that world, above all, was not harmony, but what we might call the border as an existential condition. Assimilated Jews of the Habsburg Empire embodied this condition paradigmatically. As Arthur Schnitzler wrote in his letters, they had to feel everything, Jewish, German, Hungarian, Viennese, and doing so, paradoxically, they felt nothing fully and nothing really. Quirino Principe described them as the glue of the empire, but after the disintegration of Austria-Hungary, this inner condition of borderlessness was violently fragmented. Julia Kristeva's concept of identity as a state of relation, unquote, always negotiating between the familiar and the foreign, strangers to themselves, captures the condition that was at once the trauma and the creative engine of this literature. Baslen, born in Trieste in 1902, embodied this condition personally. He grew up speaking German with his father, Italian with his mother, and Slovenian with his governess, a polyglot environment without a stable identity. A secular Jew suspended between Christianity, he went to the Protestant school, and Judaism, he experienced a profound detachment from all communal belonging that was crucially generative rather than paralyzing. Language for him was not the marker of identity, but a dynamic activity, so to say. After 1919, when Trieste became part of Italy and the city's German-speaking population began to immigrate, the private libraries ended up on the market stalls of the old Jewish quarter. The young Baslen discovered these treasures there, as he recounted in his forged interview about Trieste. Among those volumes were not only the canonical figures of the Viennese modernism, the likes of Altenberg, Schnitzler, Hofmannsthal, and Stefan Zweig, but also Freud, Ernst Mach, and Karl Kraus. Baslen grasped something his Italian contemporaries had not yet seen. that this flea market literature addressed the central anxieties of modernity, the unconscious, the impossibility of communication, the crisis of language, the downside of modernization. Themes that received scant attention in the dominant traditions of Italian literature. For Baslen, as Gaston Bachelard might have put it, literature became a way to inhabit the espace de notre solitude, the intimate spaces left by the void of civilizational collapse. The sole Italian language representative of this tradition was Italo Svevo, alias Hector Schmitz. Svevo's novels seemed like foreign bodies within Italian letters, leading readers into the analysis of the unconscious and the crisis of values of the new century. He was himself a posthumous person, a figure formed by Habsburg Trieste, who wrote in Italian as a kind of a voluntary exile from his own cultural formation. Crucially, Boris Pahor's choice of Slovenian was a contrastic Triestine statement, a deliberate assertion of personal identity through language. Baslen, by contrast, refused to make any such choice. He wrote an unfinished novel, Der Kapitän, in German, and his letters in both Italian and German, but above all, he refused to publish. His refusal is itself significant. It speaks to a vision of literature as almost sacramental, a form of life rather than a form of career. It is also the central irony of his legacy. The man who shaped Italian publishing more profoundly than almost any other figure of this generation, and we will soon see, did so entirely by not publishing. The concept around which Baslen's entire literary sensibility cohered is what he called the libro unico, the singular book. Roberto Calasso, later he was the main publisher of Adelphi, who carried Baslen's vision forward at the publishing house for almost 50 years, described this principle with his characteristic precision. I quote, "One immediately recognizes, reading a singular book, that something has happened to the author, and that something has deposited itself in writing. The author had to have been traversed by this other thing, had to have lived inside it, absorbed it into the physiology, possibly transforming it into style. If that had happened, those were the books that most attracted Baslen. Singular books were therefore also books that had very never become books at all." The singular book is not defined by aesthetic virtuosity or ideological utility, but by existential necessity. The book as an irreducible force, as irreducible trace of life traversed by another. What Baslen sought was specifically the literature of the posthumous person, writing born not from a program, but from surviving. The singular book is not defined by aesthetic virtuosity. This philosophy had concrete consequences. When Baslen worked as a consultant at the Italian publishing house Einaudi in the 1950s, it was he and Luciano Foha who drove the controversial publication of Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, The Man ohne Eigenschaften. A decision contested within Einaudi's board, where the book's fragmentary anti-historical character was regarded as an affront to the Marxist fraction, which at the time was predominant in Italian cultural institutions. The book was, by any criterion, a singular book. Frustrated by growing differences at Einaudi, Baslen co-founded Adelphi Milan in 1962, along with his former longtime Einaudi consultant, Marcello Foa. The controversy leading to this foundation was the publication of the new edition of Nietzsche's opus, drawn directly from the manuscripts conserved in the archive in Weimar. A gigantic editorial operation led by Giorgio Colli and Mazzino Montinari, which was too ideologically audacious for Einaudi. Adelphi eventually became the first Italian publisher to explicitly distinguish Middle European literature from German literature as a category, as I said before, a declaration that this was a different tradition with different coordinates and different stakes. Baslin suddenly died in 1965. Whether he left behind a single coherent list of titles he wished to publish is a question that remains open also to myself. The evidence points that there is not really a one unified document, but there is a scattered archive of letters of recommendation, publishers' reports, notebooks, and personal correspondence, a constellation of suggestions rather than a program. What Roberto Calasso, the very historical phase of Adelphi until 2021, inherited was therefore not a manifesto, but rather a sensibility. Materialized in hundreds of individual judgments, that sensibility was nonetheless consistent enough to shape Adelphi's program for the next half-century. When Calasso took full management in 1971, he was explicit about what distinguished Adelphi from Einaudi. Had we win, I quote, had we win Einaudi in the 1950s, we would have immediately sought to find an introductory author to legitimize the process and guide the reader towards a correct reading. But Adelphi never had a penchant for political statements and pedagogy. End quote. Adelphi's reader was imagined as already curious, drawn not by ideological guidance, but by the book as an object of fascination. The Adelphiana 1971, the house's first programmatic anthology, gathered Ingeborg Bachmann alongside Friedrich Nietzsche, Robert Walser, Karl Kraus, and Thomas Bernhard. Not a thematic anthology, but a demo, an invitation to inhabit a particular atmosphere. This was not just evident between the lines of the catalog section, but also within paratexts themselves. The construction of an imaginary Central Europe through Adelphi's publication was not achieved only by the texts themselves. It was achieved equally and perhaps even more powerfully through what Gérard Genette theorized as the paratext, the seuil, the threshold elements that surround and mediate a text before the reader has opened a single page, which means titles, preface, back cover blurbs, cover designs, typography, the physical presentation of the book as object. For Adelphi, the paratext was not incidental decoration, but a primary instrument of editorial philosophy. We can say this more or less for every publishing house nowadays, but at that time, in the 1960s and 70s, it was still in Italy kind of seminal. Two paratextual elements are central in my analysis. The first one is the so-called prière d'Anseré, the brief curatorial note on a dust jacket. In Adelphi's hands, this became a distinctive literary genre, not a conventional summary, but a lapidary evocation of the book's atmosphere. Its world, its necessity, often written by Calasso himself. These texts collectively constitute a map of the imaginary Central Europe Adelphi was building in the imagination of its readers. They do not explain or recommend, they invoke and evoke. They create in the reader the expectation of a specific mood before a word of the text has been read. The second is the cover design, the characteristic Adelphi aesthetic, a pentally or photographic image chosen for its atmospheric resonance, set against a colored ground, ochre, deep blue, pale green, violet, etc., with a distinctive typeface. This design was drawn directly from Audrey Bursley's. Longtime readers of Adelphi described recognizing an Adelphi book from across a bookshop by its spine alone. The cover as a signature, as a guarantee of taste, as promise. That is Stimmung as well, materialized as design, what Gumprecht would call a presence effect created before the act of reading begins. Taking together the prière d'Anseré and the cover design constitute what we can call the mood as a publishing product. And this applied very well in conveying the Middle European mood. A curated atmosphere, melancholy without despair, irony without cynicism, cosmopolitanism without politics. My hypothesis is that this mood appealed to a new kind of wild readership, to use Klaus Wagenbach's term, wary of the ideological prescription of both the Prussian and the Marxist cultural fields that ruled the cultural life in Italy at that time. Now, let's just stop to a few critical literature I'm using, actually. Critical literature I'm using. Take a look at the pictures and tell me if what they do is also not just evoke some biases along with an imaginary version of Central Europe. Especially, well, we can say this was published in '63, but this cover is rather new, and it's typically, this is typically Viennese. This was published in the 80s, and Mitteleuropa is also very Viennese here. This is a sculpture in Navona Square in Rome, actually. And there are four figures. They are the depictions of different places on Earth, and they are depictions of rivers. There is the Nile River, there is the Yangtze, the Yellow River, and so on. There is the Danube. This one is the Danube. So again, Mitteleuropa, we are identified with the Danube. This is pretty much interesting. Came out in 2011. We have the first Slavic sign, so to say, that Mitteleuropa maybe has also something to do with a Slavic-speaking country. Here, actually, the Castle Bridge in Prague. And this is also interesting because this is a publication, a newspaper, actually scientific paper, and it reads in French a continent imaginaire, an imaginary continent, which is pretty much what also the figure here describes. This is pretty much high Sicilian Baroque. It tells a lot about what imagination, is the intention of this paratext here. Anyway, let's go further into the catalog, the very catalog of Adelphi. Today, the Literatura Mitteleuropea catalog of Adelphi comprises 150 titles. The only Italian and possibly the only major European publishing house to maintain a Middle European literature as an explicit catalog category, distinct from both Germanic literature, German literature, and Slavic literatures, as I told before. That taxonomic choice is itself an act of canon construction, and the catalog repays close examination. The most published authors are Josef Roth with 26 titles, Shanur Mare with 19 titles, Elias Canetti with 16, Alexander Leonard Volenia with 14, Isaac Bashevis Singer with 10, Stefan Zweig with 9, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Leo Perutz, and Arthur Schnitzler with 8 each, Israel Joshua Singer with 6, and Hermann Broch with 4. A further dozen authors, among them Alfred Kubin, Karl Kraus, Eugen von Horvath, Peter Altenberg, Soma Morgenstern, and Johannes Ursedil appear also with 1 to 3 titles each. The chronological distribution tells a precise story. The 1960s yield a single title, Alfred Kubin's Die andere Seite, which is circulating now. 1965, which is a haunted, oniric novel of a submerged alternative world, a more programmatic opening, which is hard to imagine for a publishing house like Adelphi. Here are some books. The only one which fits actually in the category Literatura Mitteleuropea is actually the Kubin one. We have an interesting codex here, which was kind of introducing and seductive for the audience, Italian audience at the time, because this is explicitly Freudian psychology, which was a very long time kind of censored in Italy because of fascism. We have another psychological book here, Erich Heller. We have a classical of, I would just put it into Middle European literature, but it is rather under Judaism, which is the classic of Jiří Langer, The Nine Doors. Hasidism. Yeah, or Hasidism, actually. Then we have a classical of Viennese philosophy, Wittgenstein, his lectures, and the myth biography of a German psychoanalyst who lived in exile in Rome and was a fundamental guidance for Roberto Baslen, Calasso himself, and also for very famous film director Roberto Fellini. Then come the 70s, actually. In the 70s had 19 titles in the Middle European catalog, establishing the core of the German language Austrian canon. Hofmannsthal from 1970, then Karl Kraus and Wedekind in 1972, Roth and Horvath in 1974, Schnitzler in 1975, Canetti from 74 and 78 again. And then come the 80s with 33 titles, which consolidated this horizon. There is more Roth, more Canetti, more Schnitzler, more Leonard Holenia from 1982, and Leo Perutz from 1987. The dominant language across these two foundational decades is unambiguously German. The dominant cultural horizon is Austro-Hungarian Vienna and its satellites. Then in 1998, something shifts. Sándor Márai enters the catalog with Le Bracci, which is also circulating somewhere here. And there it is. I spoke once with a Hungarian colleague of mine, and she said to me she was kind of fascinated because Sándor Márai was considered for a very long time in Hungary as one of these very dusty and almost unreadable authors of a lost time, so to say. She was kind of shocked that he had such a huge impact in Italy in the 90s. Nevertheless, this is the first major non-German language presence in the Middle European catalog. Not the first one, but the first great bestseller. The Italian response was in fact extraordinary. Adelphi eventually published 19 Márai titles, making him the second most published author in the entire Middle European catalog. The 2000s and the 2010s see a gradual broadening. Milan Fürst in Hungarian, János Szekely, Ferenc Karinthy, and the Singer brothers in Yiddish, Israel Joshua Singer from 2013, Isaac Bashevis Singer from 2017, Eda Margolius Kovács in Czech. And the catalog continues to grow with new titles as recently as 2026. We have now, well, this was definitely due, but this was still Austrian, pretty much. So this is a new edition that was never translated from Yiddish before in no language at all, not even in English. This is a new discovery, Miklós Szent-Kutin, and yeah, there is still this kind of evergreen of Adelphi, which is correspondence letters and so on. In this case, between Roth and Josef Roth and Stefan Zweig. Anyway, this reveals also the structural drama of the canon. The first phase, 1965 to 1990, is almost entirely German language. It reflects Baslen's personal linguistic competences. He did not read Slavic languages or Hungarian. And a specific German-Austrian mediation through which Mitteleuropa entered Italian Germanistic in the 1960s. And the second phase, from 1998 to the present, represents a gradual expansion, but one that follows the logic of success rather than revision. Marai entered the catalogue after Le Bracci, became an unexpected bestseller, not as a programmatic correction of the German language bias anyway. The Slavic languages, Slovak, Slovenian, Croatian, Polish, Serbian, remain almost entirely absent from the Middle European catalogue. They still are very present in the Slavic literature's canon, but not in the Middle European one. They are relegated actually to an extra category. Danilo Kiš's Encyclopedia of the Dead appeared in the Adelphi canon in 1988. Interestingly enough, Boris Pahor's Necropola never did. The series structure adds a further dimension. There is the Biblioteca, which is 96 titles in the category Middle European Literature, which is the flagship hardcover series. All the books circulating here are from this series, except for one, which is from the small biblioteca, from the Piccola Biblioteca. And in fact, it is a kind of a physical object of permanence, with also the characteristic painterly covers and quite elaborate prières d'Anceray. If you open the first page, you will see actually the jackets with the prières d'Anceray written. Then there is the Piccola Biblioteca, which is made out of 40 titles, and it is the pocket paperback extension of the same philosophy, so to say, functioning as the vehicle for shorter works and the secondary titles of singular book authors. Both series carry Baslin's work vision forward. In Genette's terms, the series name itself, stamped on its spine, is already part of the paratext, a promise about the kind of encounter on offer. Then there is the Fabula series. I didn't manage to bring any of these books right now from this series, but they are just 4 titles. It covers a different kind of spectrum. It was conceived not for the timeless singular book, but for the contemporary, more zeitgeist-oriented authors. Its Middle European titles, Werfel, Milan Fürst, János Szekely, Ferenc Karinci, were all assigned to Fabula before the Marai phenomenon demonstrated that the Hungarian author could sustain the full Biblioteca treatment. A Fabula book belongs to the present conversation. A Biblioteca book belongs to essential literature, so to say, which responds to the singular book principle. The fact that Hungarian language authors first entered the catalogue via Fabula, while German language authors had occupied the Biblioteca from the beginning, is a small but legible signal. Singular book status for the German core was taken as self-evident, while for other languages it first had to be proven. Once proven, as Marai's 19 Biblioteca titles confirm, the gate opened fully. This is at least what I can deduce from the analysis of the catalogue. More information has proven to be difficult to obtain from the original source, and while the correspondence with former Adelphi consultant Roberto Gilodi gave me many hints for the analysis, I still could not obtain crucial information about the selection criteria of this legendary section, which we call Middle European literature. But what precisely happens to Mitteleuropa in Italy from the early 1960s onwards? The cultural historian Arduino Agnelli, speaking at the landmark 1985 Parma conference, Mitteleuropa, Storiografia e Scritture, offered a lucid characterization. I quote, "It is a peculiar trait of Italian culture to use the term Mitteleuropa for historical arguments. As soon as a problem relating to the history of ideas, literary history, or political history is raised, Mitteleuropa is, strictly speaking, the term to be used in the true Italian style. The historian of Central Europe essentially becomes a cultural historian. In Italy," end quote. In Italy, the political meaning of the term had been so thoroughly displaced that its usage was sustained entirely by cultural and literary connotations. As Anna Baldini has argued, this deserves to be called a resemantization, a transformation not merely of usage, but of meaning. The transformation was driven by a specific historical conjuncture. First, the slow confrontation with the crimes of the fascist regime, which made re-examining the cultures fascism had attacked, not least the Jewish culture, into an act of cultural reparation. Second, the definitive establishment of Freudian psychoanalysis after a long ideological ostracism. And third, the Trieste question and the unresolved legacy of Italy's northern eastern border. Fourth, the overcoming of the dominant cultural camps, Croce's neo-Hegelianism and Gramsci's Marxism in favor of a more eclectic horizon. In this context, Kundera's formulation of the abducted West resonated deeply. I quote, Western Europe, I quote Kundera, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and that part of Europe situated geographically in the center, culturally in the West, and politically in the East, end quote. This sense of cultural distinction acquired an increasingly tragic character after the Hungarian uprising of 1956 and the Prague Spring of 1968. And it was precisely this tragic dimension, the culture of a sunken world, that proved the most potent in the Italian imagination. The heyday of the Central European literary boom in Italy, the 70s and the 80s, was not unrelated to the political climate of the years of lead. The tragic grandeur of Central European crisis literature offered a promise of cultural death in a time of immediate political violence. According to Austrian scholar Michael Hutter, this was one of the primary forces of what he calls, and I still really like the term, the Italian Mitteleuropean conjuncture. The author who most completely embodied this physiological appeal was Joseph Roth, the supreme invalid of life, the posthumous man par excellence. In the 1985 Parma conference, Calasso articulated the defining element of this transformation. I quote, the overall perception changed. This axis of Vienna is a fact we must acknowledge, one that alters our mental geography when we look at this century. Mental geography, the formation of a geographical imagination through the mediation of books, paratexts, and a carefully cultivated Stimmung of a publishing house. And the axis of that geography ran in the Adelphi version through Vienna and through the German language. Not through Krakow, unfortunately, not through Ljubljana, not through Lviv. But as history always has its ironic side, other Italian publishers, still such as Keller Editore, I just make an example, and Bollati Boringhieri, are lately rediscovering the blind spots Adelphi left, most iconically and aligned also with a certain Austrian fashion through Galicia, rediscovery of Galician literatures, and the town of Chernivtsi, Czernowtz, Czernowitz. Jacques Derrida had identified two defining moments of Eastern Europe, Central Europe's communauté de destin. The immediate post-war period and the boom of the 1980s, when Eastern Bloc exiles fostered a nostalgic revival. But the third moment requires attention, which is the Italian moment, situated between these two, in which the definition of Central Europe was determined by literary reception outside the region itself. This third moment operated in the domain of literary transfer, translation, and publishing, and fixed Mitteleuropa in Italian consciousness with a specific Viennese coloration, at a time when the Iron Curtain still made the eastern half of Central Europe largely inaccessible. The fall of the Iron Curtain transformed rather than extinguished the imaginary. In the new phase, non-German language voices began to find a larger audience, the Marai phenomenon, the Yiddish singer brothers, but also Sholem Aleichem, which was curiously published under the label Ebraismo e Cultura Ebraica and not Literatura Mitteleuropea. But the expansion follows the logic of success rather than revision. The concept has proven remarkably durable in Italy. Umberto Eco knew when he published the Cimitero di Prague, the Cemetery of Prague in 2007, that he was striking a familiar chord. The new Lecce, which is the Literature Museum of Trieste, inaugurated in 2024 and dedicated also to Baselen's legacy, continues to use the term Mitteleuropa in its descriptive framework, as if the re-sementization were complete and irreversible. But we also should note that the adjective Mitteleuropeo has become in Trieste also an identity mark of municipal belonging, which resonates intensively also through the most recent literature, above all the romancier Mauro Kovačić. So, in conclusion, I began with a word and with a problem. I would like to close with a methodological reflection and also with a challenge. I am fully aware that I do not possess the resources for a comprehensive sociological study of Italian readers' perception of Mitteleuropa. What I can offer is something more like an indirect inference, the method of an astronomer who infers the existence of an invisible planet from the gravitational disturbances it causes in other celestial bodies. With the aid of secondary literature, press articles, blurb texts, catalog structures, and sometimes even readers' blogs, the Adelphi phenomenon, this way of re-sementization of Mitteleuropa through a publishing philosophy, can be reconstructed from a cultural studies perspective. What that reconstruction reveals is the following. Mitteleuropa, or Mitteleuropa, in Italy was not simply a concept imported from the German-speaking world. It was actively reinvented, re-cementized, through a specific conjuncture of scholarly mediation, publishing practice, and cultural conjuncture, like deprovincialization, rediscovery of Judaism in Italy, the political crisis of the 1970s, etc. At the center of this reinvention was the philosophy of the singular book and the work of many, many people, almost entirely women, who did the work of translating, mediating, and correcting in the shadow. There is a wonderful book by Renata Colorni, an historical translator for Adelphi, which is exactly the title. It carries the title "The Job in the Shadows." Actually, in the end, the conviction that singular book would work has proven, in fact, very intelligent for this publishing house. The conviction that certain books are irreplaceable traces of lives traversed by catastrophe, and that their publication is an act not of cultural commerce, but of cultural survival. The Stimmung that Adelphi cultivated through its paratexts was the aesthetic form this convention took in the marketplace of Italian culture. Moritz Ciacchi's concept of the memory of Central Europe is useful here, not as a fixed historical memory, but a layered, contested, and constantly reconstructed set of cultural references. What Adelphi did was to give this memory a particular Italian inflection. Melancholy without despair, irony without cynicism, cosmopolitanism without politics. The catalogs are from Kubin in 1965 through the German language Austrian core of the 70s and 80s, the Hungarian expansion of the 80s and 90s, the Yiddish arrivals of the 2010s. All then tell the story of a gradual and partial widening, shaped as much as by the accidents of biography, because Basel, for example, did not read Slavic languages, and market success, Marai's unexpected bestsellers, as by any programmatic cultural vision. And this brings me to the challenge, the one I feel most acutely in presenting this paper here. The canon that Baslen bequeathed and Calasso built is a generally extraordinary achievement. He brought into Italian hands a literary world that had been almost entirely inaccessible, with a consistency of taste and quality of presentation that has no real parallel in Italian publishing, and just a few similar exponents in Europe. But it is also a canon built primarily from a German language shore. Kisch's ironic lyricism named the Slavic and Hungarian ingredients as a constitutive of the Central European literary style. The Adelphi catalogue, for the most part, did not act on that insight. The Slovak winter resorts into Oberg's memoir remain in the Italian imaginary of Mitteleuropa picturesque backdrop rather than generative center. That could have struck a chord in Italy in the 1960s and 70s following the rather popular cultural instances of, for example, the Strapaese wave. But centrally, Adelphi was not the right platform for it. Adelphi was something else, the publisher of everything that both Croatianism and Marxism did not take seriously. The fragmentary, the irrational, the fantastic, the eclectic, the lost, the dreamy, in one sentence, the province of official culture. Presenting this paper before a Slovak audience, I find myself conscious of an irony that Kisch himself would have appreciated. The very concept through which Italy rediscovered the cultural richness of this part of Europe, that concept that made Kafka, Roth, Musil, and Canetti into household names in Italian living rooms, was also, in its dominant form, a concept that rendered the literary traditions of the very peoples who most physically present in this room as marginal, as a supplement to someone else's imaginary. That is not a reason to abandon the concept. It is a reason to insist on its incompleteness, to press for the expansion of the imaginary, and to ask, as Kisch did, what Central Europe looks like from the Slavic shore, as well as from the Viennese coffee house. The invisible planet is in fact real, but it has, as all planets do, multiple faces, and not all of them have been equally illuminated yet. Thank you for your attention.